Hi, this is a quick video to explain 4.3.1 measures of development. So the specification says A, the three dimensions of the HDI and how they're measured and combined, and then B, the advantages and limitations of using the HDI to compare levels of development between countries and over time. So those are the areas that I'm just going to try and cover now. So, what is the HDI? Well, the HDI is a composite indicator of economic development, and that word composite means that it measures development by measuring more than one variable. So, in the case of that affects the quality of life, so it considers more than one variable that affects the quality of life. So, it's a composite indicator of development. So the HDI considers three variables. It averages three variables, and those variables are the mean years of schooling, which is a way of measuring education and takes into account the fact that knowledge is obviously an important aspect of the quality of life. So in the UK, our mean years of schooling would be I would imagine sort of 13 years, because these days not many people leave school at 16. The second variable that's averaged within the HDI calculation is life expectancy. Obviously, a higher life expectancy in a country is indicative of a better quality of life. And then the final one is GNI per capita, measured in US dollars, converted using a purchasing power parity exchange rate. So obviously that's it. Per capita incomes are important. They affect the quality of life in material terms. The more that people earn, the more they consume, and therefore the more utility they're able to experience. So that's basically how the HDI is calculated. It's an average of those three variables: mean years of schooling, life expectancy, and GNI per capita. So if we think about some of the advantages of the HDI, I think the first advantage that I would talk about is that it can create some political competition between governments. No politician likes to look bad and be shown up. So every year the United Nations publishes HDI statistics for every country in the world, and those countries are put into league tables, and it obviously looks pretty bad if you're towards the bottom of that league table, particularly if your GDP per capita is relatively high. You might be in the top 10 in terms of GDP per capita, or the top 2 if it's the US. But in contrast, if your HDI is relatively low, maybe you're 7th in the world or 8th in the world on HDI, but you're much higher in per capita income, it shows that the quality of decision making in that country isn't particularly good. You're a rich country, but you're not really using that wealth effectively to promote a high quality of life. On the other hand, if you look at a country like New Zealand, they're often very, very high on the HDI in terms of their league table position, surprisingly so given their relatively modest per capita income. So that political pressure might encourage politicians to do something about it, to improve the quality of their decision making, maybe to spend the taxes that they collect a little bit more sensibly. So rather than wasting the money on weapons, they might use some of the taxes instead to build some more hospitals and schools. The second big advantage of the HDI is that it considers both material and non-material aspects of development. Obviously, the per capita income aspect of the HDI takes into account the fact that consumption and enjoying material pleasures adds to the quality of life. But it also takes into account non-material aspects of development, such as knowledge and a long and healthy life. So it's a much broader way of measuring economic development than just looking at per capita income in isolation. It considers three aspects of development. Per capita income would only consider one, so it's broader. A third one is that you could argue it's relatively cheap and easy to collect data on life expectancy and mean years of schooling. Furthermore, most countries already collect GDP figures and GNI figures. So it should be fairly easy to collect those figures, and hopefully the data that's collated by the United Nations should be fairly reliable. Yeah, and those are really the main advantages of the HDI. What I'm just going to read to you now actually comes from a United Nations Human Development Report, and I think it sums it up fairly well. So they say the HDI was created to emphasize that people and their capabilities should be the ultimate criteria for assessing the development of a country, not economic growth alone. The HDI can also be used to question national policy choices, asking how two countries with the same level of GNI per capita can end up with different human development outcomes. These contrasts can stimulate debate about government policy priorities. The HDI is a summary measure of average achievement in key dimensions of human development: a long and healthy life, being knowledgeable, and have a decent standard of living. The HDI is a mean of the indices for each of these three dimensions. So that's basically what it is and what the advantages of the HDI are. So if we turn now to think about what some of the drawbacks of the HDI might be. An obvious criticism is that you can say, well, yeah, the HDI is broader than just looking at per capita incomes, but it's still not broad enough because there are plenty of other variables that affect a country's quality of life that are excluded from the HDI. So, for example, most people would say that gender equality and religious freedoms are an important aspect of the quality of life within a country, whether people are free to practice a religion that they want to practice, or whether women can wear short skirts and have careers. A decent person, in my opinion, would say, well, those rights are part and parcel of a civilized society that enjoys a high quality of life. People should be free to make those decisions. Likewise, you could say, well, the HDI, it doesn't take into account freedom from servitude, like whether people have the right to express their point of view. It also doesn't take into account the quality of the environment, levels of pollution. So you could think about that in the context of China. China's HDI looks brilliant, but then you've also got to take into account that the economic growth that they've achieved has been at the expense of really, really poor air pollution, or air quality rather. The second limitation of the HDI is it fails to take into account the existence of inequality. So again, if you took a country like Qatar, its GNI per capita would look pretty high, and that would help to push its HDI index score up. However, the distribution of income in those sorts of countries are very, very uneven, and the HDI just doesn't take that into account. Likewise, income inequality will mean that some people in the Middle East end up living much longer lives than others. and the mean average might not be representative of the true picture for the vast majority of people. So that's also a problem with the HDI. It doesn't take into account the existence of unequal development outcomes. It's just an average. Another thing that you could say is, along the same lines of that, is that there could be quite significant regional variations in a country's HDI. So China produces one HDI score, but the level of economic development in the coastal cities will be a lot higher than the level of development in the centre of China, where there's still a lot of farming going on and very low levels of development. Another thing that you could say is that some of the information used to calculate the Human Development Index might be unreliable. So even in the case of Britain, we're not completely sure how many people live in Britain, because we don't really keep, for example, we don't actually require people who come to live here to get residency permits. We don't keep records of the people coming and going from Britain, so we don't really know what the population of the UK is. So that means it's very difficult to calculate HDI, because we don't know what GNI per capita is, because we don't know what the population is. At the time that I'm speaking now, the sort of mid-April 2020, we're not completely sure even of how many people are dying every day from coronavirus. So you could argue that we should exercise a degree of caution when making judgments about a country's HDI ranking, because the data used to construct the HDI might be inaccurate in some countries. So that's all that I want to say about the HDI, how it's calculated, and the pros and cons of it. Hopefully you found that reasonably useful. Bye.